tonight we continue, and we're going to look at Esther chapter 5. This is kind of like the halfway point in this story, and tonight we're going to try to cover all of chapter 5. Quick review. The book begins with King Xerxes and his great banquet, and the most significant thing that happens there is Vashti the queen is deposed. She is removed from office, and that leads us into the three main characters. And they're introduced in chapters 2 and 3, Esther, Mordecai, and Haman. And the author tells a story about each of them. Esther becomes the new queen. So a Jewish girl is now the queen of the Persian Empire. Mordecai uncovers a plot to assassinate the king, and he saves the king's life. But somehow the king forgets about that and never honors him. And the reader is left going, what happened? We expected Mordecai to receive this great position of honor, but he doesn't. And it looks like that whole incident is forgotten. But instead of Mordecai being honored, this man named Haman gets honored. And we're not even told what he did. He must have done something on behalf of the king, but the king honors Haman instead. And then there's this growing tension between Mordecai and Haman. Mordecai is a Jewish man. Haman is an Amalekite. He's introduced as an Agagite, which takes us back to the story of Agag and King Saul, all the way back in the Old Testament, about 500 years before this story takes place. In fact, the Israelites and the Amalekites have been fighting for about 1,000 years. And Haman finds out that there's this guy named Mordecai who won't honor him, respect him, or bow down before him, which the king had issued an edict that everybody was supposed to do that. And then Haman finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, and that sets him off. So Haman decides, not only do I want to get even with Mordecai, this is a chance to get even with all the Jewish people for all the terrible things they've done to our ancestors in the past. So to try to make up for 1,000 years of animosity, Haman convinces King Xerxes to issue an edict that all the Jewish people would be put to death on a certain date. And it just so happens the date that was chosen is 11 months after the edict goes out. So the order goes out 11 months in advance of that. All the Jewish people are to be put to death. That brings us to the third section, which is Esther's courageous decision. And we're going to try to finish this section tonight. It begins with Mordecai's pain. Mordecai reads the edict. He's one of the king's officials. Apparently he got an early copy of it. He reads it, and he puts on sackcloth and puts ashes on his head and goes about wailing and weeping. In many ways, he's having a funeral for the Jewish people 11 months before anyone dies. And Mordecai is absolutely beside himself. Esther sends him some clothes, and he refuses them, and Mordecai at this point is a mess. But he does end up having a plan. And the most interesting part of this chapter is that Mordecai and Esther have a conversation, but they're never in the same room. There's a messenger who goes in between, taking messages from one to the other. The messenger happens to be someone who works for Queen Esther. And Mordecai's plan is really not for Mordecai to do anything. Mordecai's plan is for Esther to fix the problem. And his great plan is that she's supposed to go before the king and beg for mercy on behalf of the Jewish people. Perhaps the best thing that Mordecai did was his famous line that we always remember. Perhaps you came to royal power for such a time as this. So at least he puts that thought in Esther's head. And Esther has to wrestle with this because she knows if she goes into the king's presence uninvited, unsummoned, she could potentially lose her life. Or she could lose her position as queen. So at the end of chapter 4, Esther says, I'm calling a 3-day fast. Nobody eats for 3 days. I'm not going to eat. Everyone under my authority is not going to eat for 3 days. And Mordecai, go tell all the Jewish people who live in Susa not to eat for 3 days. It's a 3-day fast. Then after the fast, I will go before the king. She's made up her mind. She's determined. She's going to do this. It's the right thing to do. And she says, if I perish, I perish. I know it's risky. I know it's dangerous, but it's the right thing to do, and I am going to do it. And that brings us to Esther's petition, which is where we are tonight in chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. Now, chapter 5 is one of irony and surprise. We go from a time of fasting to a time of an invitation to feast. So we're back to a banquet again, which is so prominent in the book of Esther. It appears that Esther's plans are carefully thought out. Esther has a plan to go before the king, and she carefully plans this out. But at the same time, she keeps delaying. One of the great strategies that Esther has is that she delays. And the delays create suspense. And as we're reading the book, we're going, what's she going to do? And what's she going to say? And she delays again. Well, that's chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. Let me read the chapter, and then we'll talk about it tonight. So one of the most fascinating chapters in the book is chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for them." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction, as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." His wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. Fascinating chapter. And it all begins with Esther approaching the king. The stakes are high as Esther enters the palace, the inner court of the palace where the king is seated on his throne. And Esther fully knows that to approach the king in his palace in that way, uninvited and unsummoned, is against Persian law. She could be put to death. She could be deposed. But she is determined to do the right thing and to go before the king. But Esther has thought this through as she does this. It says on the third day, and this is the third day of the fast. And Esther is going to keep her promise because she made the promise, fast for me for 3 days. And after 3 days, I will go before the king. That had to have been a difficult 3 days. Now the 3 days are up, and Esther is determined to approach the king. So she does. And to approach the king, she puts on her royal robes. I mean, what a sight that must have been. I mean, here's Queen Esther, who is very beautiful to begin with, and she's dressed to the nines in her royal robes. And she walks into the king's chamber, into the inner court, where the king is seated on the throne. And the king, he's decked out even more luxurious than she is. Historians have talked about the beautiful robes of the king. They glittered with splendor. They were extremely costly. They had gold and precious stones. This is a scene of absolute royalty. Esther knew what she was doing. And by being decked out as the queen, she represented royalty. She represented the Persian Empire. And any sensible king would not have his queen put to death when she looked that beautiful and represented the Persian Empire. Unless, of course, he had an issue with her to begin with, or was looking for a way to get rid of her. But apparently, Xerxes doesn't want to get rid of Queen Esther. And when he sees this beautiful woman walk into his presence, he decides to receive her. I put the word stood in green to draw attention to it, because by standing in the inner court of the palace, Esther knows that she's breaking Persian law. She's not allowed to be there. She doesn't have an invitation from the king to be there. So she knows what she's doing. But she also knows that if the king, he can't accept her. He can reach forward the gold scepter and allow her to be there. And that's a chance she absolutely must take. This particular scene is all about royalty. In fact, the word royalty in Hebrew appears 3 times. It doesn't appear 3 times in English. The first one is Esther puts on royalty. It translates that she puts on her royal robes. But she puts on the royalty of the Persian Empire. The king is seated on his royal throne, and this all happens in the house of royalty. Also, King Xerxes is mentioned 3 times as the king. Esther has now entered the world of the king. And unless he had summoned her in that way before, this is the first time, perhaps in 5 years, that she's ever walked into that scene. Here's this Jewish girl walking into a scene of Persian royalty. I'm sure she held her breath as she did. It reminds me of a story from my own life. I used to pastor a church in Maryland, and in Maryland was the Patuxent Naval Base, and I had a church member named Rob, who was a Master Chief in the United States Navy. And after 30 years of service, the Navy decided to retire him. Rob would have served in the Navy to the day he died if they allowed him, but they decided his time was up and he needed to retire. So they were going to have this retirement ceremony for him on base at the Patuxent Naval Base. And Rob decided that for his retirement ceremony, he wanted 3 speakers. One to talk about God, one to talk about family, and one to talk about the Navy. God, family, and country. And he asked me to talk about his relationship with God. So even though I was there for like 7 years, I had never been on base because I'd never been in the military. But on that day, I was allowed on base. And so I drove up, and the person at the window there knew exactly who I was. My name was written down. It was okay for me to enter. And then I was taken upstairs where the Master Chiefs are, along with the admirals. I got to meet some Navy admirals on that day. And they were all dressed in what they call their dress blues. They were dressed to the nines. And here I was in a nice suit, in a tie, but I felt so out of place. I had entered into a world I knew nothing about. This was the world of the Navy, and that was a new world for me on that day. And I'm sure that's how Esther, the Jewish girl, felt, walking before the king going, wow, look at this. I'm so out of place, but I'm here. Amazing story. An amazing courage to take that chance to walk before the king. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she's not supposed to be there, but she's standing in the court, he was pleased. And he held out to her the gold scepter. Then Esther approaches and touches the tip of the scepter, knowing that she is now accepted. And when she saw that gold scepter being extended to her, I'm sure she took a deep sigh. Whew. I made it. Esther has 2 barriers to overcome that day. One was her acceptance, and 2 is her request, because she has to make a request on behalf of the Jewish people. First of all, she has to be accepted, and then second, she has to make her request. Well, she's cleared the first barrier. She is now accepted. And Esther had good reason to be in fear that day. Some archaeologists have uncovered 2 3-dimensional sculptures. And in these sculptures, it was a Persian king seated on his throne with a long scepter in his right hand. But standing behind the king was a soldier holding a large axe. He was defending the king. So if you go there uninvited, you're either going to get the scepter or the axe. You'll either be accepted or you will leave with your head cut off. And the good news for Esther, as she faced the threat of death and the hope of life, she was accepted. In fact, the king must have been in a really good mood that day, because he says in verse 3, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" Now, the king knows that for Esther to approach him uninvited and to risk possible death, she must have something really important on her mind. And so the king says to her, what is it? What can I do for you? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you. Now, we know that last phrase, even up to half the kingdom, from a different story. That story's in the New Testament. It's the story of John the Baptist. And during a party, King Herod is throwing this great party, and everybody's drinking, and at this point they're pretty well drunk. And then it was the daughter of Herodias who comes in and performs some kind of dance. And it pleases the king. And so the king says to her, I'll give you anything you want, up to half the kingdom. It will be yours. Well, we may conclude from that story that offering half the kingdom is something that a drunk king offers to a beautiful woman who happens to delight him. But actually, this is a figure of speech. It's not to be taken literally. So Queen Esther can't say, okay, I'll tell you what, king, you rule over the eastern half of the empire and I'll take the western half. That sounds like a great deal. That's really not what he's asking or what he's offering. What he's really saying is, whatever you want, I feel gracious today. So ask me for whatever you want, and chances are you're going to get it. So, the queen gets accepted. And then she's presented with this generous offer. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. And so we would expect in verse 4 that the queen would say something about the Jewish people. That she would say, King, I'm here on behalf of the Jewish people. And by the way, I'm one of them. And we've got to do something about Haman's edict to wipe out my people. You've got to show mercy, King. You've got to help us. Well, that's what we would expect. But here's what we get. If it pleases the king, and by the way, before you make a request to the king, you got to butter him up. If this makes the king happy, because after all, the Persian Empire is all about making the king happy. The king has to be happy. So if it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for them. It's like, wait a second, Esther. You weren't supposed to go before the king to invite him to lunch. You were supposed to go before the king on behalf of the Jewish people. But she doesn't. It appears that she has a plan, because the banquet is today. So she goes in there wanting to invite the king to a banquet to honor him. That's her plan. Maybe she felt that the king on his throne and asking something on behalf of the Jewish people was not the best time to ask. Maybe the king, at lunch, after he's had some delicious food and a couple of glasses of wine, maybe that would be a better time to speak on behalf of the Jewish people. So she deliberately invites him to a banquet. But she also invites Haman. It's like, what's she thinking? She doesn't want Haman in the room, because that's not how we do things. If we want to talk about somebody, we don't invite them. We make sure they're not there. So, shouldn't Esther just, have this one-on-one with the king and convince the king that Haman's a terrible person when he's not in the room? Why is she inviting Haman to the banquet? But she does. Well, Esther arranges for the banquet. And it's going to take place that same day. And King Xerxes, I'm coming. Without a doubt. I would love to come to a banquet sponsored by the queen. And Haman, somebody find Haman and tell him to come at once. Because we're going to a banquet by the queen. This is going to be great. we also learn something, and it's a clue. The king says, so that we may do what Esther asks. There's a clue that if it comes down between Esther and Haman, the king may very well choose Esther over Haman. It doesn't appear in the English text, but back in chapter 3, verse 5, it talks about the word of the king. And the word of the king is his authoritative command. And what this really says in the Hebrew is, so that we may do the word of Esther. The authoritative command of Esther. So get Haman, because we're going to do what Esther wants us to do. So Esther has accomplished something. She has the king and Haman at her beck and call. And they're going to do what she wants them to do. So apparently at this point, she has a strategy. She has a plan. So they go to the banquet, and as they were drinking wine, and chances are that's towards the end of the banquet. So the banquet's about to wrap up. They're drinking wine. The king's probably had several, knowing King Xerxes. And the king again will ask Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? And again, even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. For Esther, it may not get any better than that. The king is basically saying, whatever you want, queen, I'm going to say yes. And so we're ready for this now. We're really ready. And Esther replies, my petition and my request is this. And again, we expect, king, you've got to do something to save the Jewish people. You've got to intervene and save me and my people, the Jews. But that's not what she says. Maybe she wanted to say that, but she didn't. Maybe she's being careful. I mean, maybe this isn't the best time to ask for something for the Jewish people. Maybe she's playing games with the king and piquing his curiosity just a little bit. You know, if I make him wait, he's more likely to say yes. Or maybe Esther's losing confidence. Maybe she doesn't want to say what she knows she needs to say. Maybe she's stalling. Maybe she's using a delay tactic. Because she says, if the king regards me with favor, again, the king's got to be happy, and it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request like you said you're going to, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet. I will prepare for them. Esther, banquet part 2? Another lunch with the king? Is she delaying? What is she doing? But she does make a promise this time. I will answer the king's question. So, tomorrow, another banquet, you come, bring Haman, and then, king, I'll let you know what I want. Wow. Well, that concludes that section. And as a reader, we're going, what's going on here? She's had 2 opportunities to tell the king, and she has delayed both times. And now the writer's going to play games with the reader, sort of. Because the next scene is not about Queen Esther. So the rest of chapter 5 is not going to be about Queen Esther. Chapter 6 is not going to be about Queen Esther. Queen Esther is not going to answer the question till chapter 7. We have 2 more stories. And now the spotlight, because Esther's going to delay for a day, the spotlight's going back to Mordecai. And there are a couple of stories about Mordecai that we have to deal with. And the first one is Haman asserts his anger. And this is a story about Haman and Mordecai. You know, we've been wondering, Mordecai mourns. He's in great emotional pain once he reads the edict. Does he have any remorse for what he did? If he had it to do over again, would he simply bow before Haman and pay him respect just to save the Jewish people? And now that the edict has been issued, does Mordecai try to become friends with Haman? You know, patch things up, try to become his buddy, get him to change his mind? Is that what he's going to try to do? Well, the story begins in verse 9. And Haman went out that day, and he went out from the lunch he had with the king and the queen, happy and in high spirits. In this verse, we see the top and the bottom of Haman's emotions. And it all has to do with honor and dishonor. The ancient world was all about honor and dishonor. Now, can you imagine being Haman and the king and the queen invited you to a banquet? I mean, it was just the 3 of you. And of all the people in the Persian Empire, you got invited to lunch with the king and the queen. I mean, wow. Talk about a stroke for your ego. Talk about being honored. Wow. So he leaves happy, and he's in high spirits. That may have been from the wine as well. But he's having a really, really good day. Until he sees Mordecai at the king's gate. Mordecai has apparently gotten rid of his sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai is back at work, working for the king, at the king's gate, doing what he's supposed to be doing. And Haman walks by. Mordecai is supposed to show him respect and honor and bow before him. But guess what? Even though the edict has been issued, Mordecai is not about to do that. In fact, he neither rises to pay respect, he doesn't show any fear or any honor toward Haman, and there's no way in the world he bows down before him. Mordecai's a little stubborn. Even the edict to eliminate all the Jewish people is not going to change his behavior. He's Jewish, and Haman's an Amalekite, and we're not getting along. And so here's Haman, having the time of his life. And he sees Mordecai, and Mordecai shows him no respect whatsoever. And just like Haman did back in chapter 3, he's filled with rage against Mordecai. Wow. Have you ever had someone in your life that just seeing them would set you off? Like Haman, you could be having the time of your life, but once you see this person, your day's ruined. If you worked with them, you tried to avoid them in the hallway. You tried to take your break. Sometime they didn't take their break. Or if it's your neighbor, you don't take your garbage out the same time he or she does. When you come home, you drive your car into the garage and immediately put the door down so you don't have to talk with them or see them. Well, that's Haman and Mordecai. These two are not going to like each other, respect each other, or have any kind of relationship. So, Haman is quite angry. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself. I mean, we could have had a confrontation. Haman could have walked over to Mordecai and said, "Hey, the king says when I pass before you, you bow before me. So start bowing before me. And if not, I'll have you arrested for breaking the king's law and perhaps have you executed." For some reason, Haman didn't want a confrontation that day. Or perhaps he was thinking, what am I going to do with this Mordecai character? But on that night, he just walks away and he goes home. But of course, when you go home, you have to talk about it. And guess who gets to hear what you have to say? His friends are there, and so is his wife, Zeresh. And so Haman's going to let them know what's going on in his life. And it begins in verse 11 with Haman boasting. Haman is a very proud man. He likes to boast. He likes to tell people what they already know. You may have had someone like that every time you get with them, they like to tell you all of their accomplishments. You've already heard it 10 times, but they're going to tell you for time number 11 because that's just who they are. They want to tell you all that they've accomplished. And it's also interesting when somebody boasts about something, we also get a clue as to what they really value in life. And what does Haman value? His money, his wealth. He has a lot of it. And maybe that's the reason that King Xerxes promoted him to begin with. He also has many sons. Also, the king has honored him. The king has taken special notice of him and has given him a position of honor. In fact, Haman has been elevated by the king above all the other nobles and officials, including Mordecai. So, what do you value? What do you love to talk about? When you get an opportunity to talk to somebody about you, what do you mention? It will tell you what you value in life. And Haman, like Xerxes, values wealth, recognition, and position. The author tells us all about Haman and all that he owns and his great accomplishments because if you have much, you also have much to lose. And that could be what happens to Haman a little bit later on. So Haman is boasting, and he's not quite done. One more thing. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to the banquet. Oh, if he only knew that Queen Esther was Jewish. If he only knew that Queen Esther and Mordecai were cousins. If he only knew that Mordecai had adopted Esther as his daughter. He doesn't know any of that. He is just absolutely enthralled by the fact that the queen has invited him to a banquet. And not only that, he gets to go back tomorrow. Because once again, Haman's been invited to have lunch with the king and the queen. Wow. Not too many people can top that. So Haman is boasting of all of his accomplishments, all that he has done. But all this gives me no satisfaction. As long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. Wow. I mean, Haman has a lot to be thankful for if he wanted to be thankful. Haman has a lot to live for. Can he not just overlook Mordecai? No. Mordecai gets under his skin. Mordecai is causing Haman to not enjoy life. There might be a great lesson there. You know, that person in your life that drives you crazy, that you talk about to your friends all the time? That person that occupies your thoughts? That person that's ruining your life? Well, that was what was happening to Haman. Haman saying, I can't even enjoy all of these things because of Mordecai. Hatred, animosity. An Israelite and an Amalekite. Neither will give an inch. And it's interesting how he refers to Mordecai, that Jew, Mordecai. Always want to name call, label people. It's part of our anger, hatred, animosity. And we see that played out in this story. So as long as Mordecai is alive and seated at the king's gate, I cannot enjoy my life, says Haman. A sad picture of this man who has so much, but yet is so miserable. And his misery, well, he's got to share it with somebody. So it's his wife and his friends who have to hear it. And perhaps his wife, every time he comes home, okay, here comes another story about Mordecai. And night after night, that's all that Haman can think about. Perhaps it's even ruining their relationship. It's all about Mordecai. So his wife comes up with an answer, a solution. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, which is 75 feet. And ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Now, this was an ancient thing. In the ancient world, it was all about honor and dishonor. And if you were an honorable person, then you would be given an honorable burial when you died. But if you were a bad person, a criminal, you would be denied a proper burial. And to do that in Persian times meant to impale somebody to a post, to a tree, and let the birds and the bugs eat away at them. I mean, that's dishonorable. You don't get a burial, and everybody who walks by you and sees this will know that you're a dishonorable person. You're a bad person. That this happened to you. So Zeresh comes up with the idea of this post being 75 feet high, which is ridiculous. But the point is, everybody could see Mordecai. And everybody would know that Haman defeated Mordecai. So don't mess with Haman, or that will happen to you as well. So, how would you like to be married to her? She comes up with this horrible thing, which is totally out of proportion for anything that Mordecai may have done. Scholars have an interesting time with 75 feet. Some think that maybe that this post was set up on a hill, and from the ground, the hill and the post go up 75 feet. That's a possibility. Some think it's an exaggeration on purpose, hyperbole. That she was making up this incredible number to make the point that everybody would see Mordecai, and Mordecai would be dishonored at the end. That seems to be the plan. And how does Haman respond to all of this? He's delighted. He thinks that's the greatest plan in the world. Now we have irony and contrast at the end of this chapter. And it's amazing because here is Haman, and he's supposed to convince the king to have Mordecai put to death and then impaled on this post so everyone can see it. And then, what's he supposed to do? He's to go to the banquet with the king and the queen and enjoy himself. You know, take somebody else's life, dishonor them, and go have a feast. Now, there's another contrast because tomorrow is going to get really interesting in this story. Tomorrow, Esther is going to hold a banquet, inviting Xerxes and Haman. And tomorrow, Haman's to go before Xerxes, asking for the death of Mordecai, and for Mordecai to be disgraced by being impaled on a post. Should be an interesting day. The agenda is huge for tomorrow. And Haman has the post set up. Immediately, he just goes out and builds the post. Now we're ready for a showdown. What's going to take place the next day? What's going to happen to Mordecai? Will Esther ever have the courage to tell Xerxes what she really wants? Well, next week we'll look at chapter 6. And if you want to read ahead, you can. A fascinating story. But a lot of lessons. Lessons of courage. Lessons of not allowing hatred in your life to take over your life. Because hatred's causing a lot of problems for Mordecai, and it's causing a lot of problems for Haman as well. Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. Father, thank you that in this story we see the courage of Esther. But at the same time, we see someone who's trying to put together a plan. Perhaps she knows exactly what she's doing, or perhaps she doesn't, so she delays. And Father, many times in life, we're not always sure of what to do. And many times we kind of hold back in having the courage to do what we know we need to do. And then there's that great lesson about not letting anger and hatred take over our lives. So much so that it controls everything we do. So much so that it ruins our life. Father, help us to love and to forgive and to move on. Father, may we learn these great lessons from these characters in this story. Father, I thank you again for the story. And may we find ourselves in this story and apply what we learn. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.